The sound of metal colliding echoes in the distance. Not the clashing of swords in some forgotten war, but something older, something that lives inside every human soul. This is not the most dangerous battle you will ever face, because the greatest battles in life are the ones that appear when you can no longer run away. Carl Jung once suggested something unsettling. Every human life eventually demands a heroic act, not a heroic gesture, not a performance of strength, a heroic act, one that costs something real. The question is not whether the hero will appear in your life. The question is whether you will answer the call. The ground trembles, the armor appears, and the battle begins. The hero is in motion. Every strike carries intention. Every step is calculated. The face is tense, but not confused. There is fear, but there is something greater than fear. The sword cuts through the air. The shield absorbs impacts. This is not merely an external battle. It is a battle that feels necessary. And then, at the peak of the fight, time slows. An old car appears between dust and chaos. The engine is calm, the steering wheel steady. Carl Jung pulls up beside the hero. He looks at you and says, without hurry, get in before fighting. It is necessary to understand. The door closes. The noise of war fades into the distance. Now a classroom, simple, a blackboard, natural light entering through the window. Carl Jung writes a single word on the board, hero. Then he pauses. He does not rush. Carl Jung has spent his entire life inside the labyrinth of the human psyche. He has traveled the myths of the world. He has listened to thousands of dreams. He has mapped the invisible forces that shape who we become. And he knows something that very few people ever dare to admit. The hero is not born from strength. He is born from necessity. Carl Jung explains. The hero archetype emerges when the psyche is confronted with something that can no longer be avoided. A crisis, a crossing. It is not a comfortable choice. It is a call. And this distinction matters enormously. A choice can be postponed. A call cannot be unanswered indefinitely. Carl Jung turns from the blackboard. He speaks slowly. In every culture across human history, the hero appears. In the Sumerian myths, in the Greek epics, in the Norse sagas, in the stories of indigenous peoples across every continent. This repetition is not a coincidence. Carl Jung observed that the hero appears in dreams, myths, and personal narratives precisely at the moment when the individual must separate from psychological childhood and face the world with responsibility. The hero archetype is not a character. It is a psychological function. It is the part of you that rises when the rest of you wants to sit down. Carl Jung puts the chalk down and faces the viewer. He says, "The archetype does not belong to any religion, any nation, any century. It belongs to the human species, and that means it belongs to you." Carl Jung returns to the blackboard. He writes 3 words: separation, initiation, return. These are the 3 movements of the hero's journey, not invented by any single storyteller. Discovered because these movements appear across all human mythology, because they mirror something that happens inside the psyche itself. The first movement is separation. The hero must leave the familiar world, the village, the comfort, the known. In psychological terms, this is the departure from the persona, the mask we wear to belong, the role we inherited from others. Carl Jung understood that the first heroic act of any individual life is to stop being what others needed you to be. That alone requires enormous courage. The second movement is initiation. This is the trial, the descent into the unknown. Mythologically, this is the cave, the underworld, the sea of monsters. Psychologically, it is the confrontation with the shadow, the parts of the self that were buried, the fears that were never faced, the grief that was never allowed to speak. The initiation is not comfortable. It was never meant to be. Carl Jung writes on the board, "What is not faced within will be met as fate from without." This is one of the most important insights of depth psychology. The trial the hero faces externally is always a reflection of what the hero must face internally. The monster outside is the monster within. The third movement is return. And this is the movement most people forget to talk about. It is not enough to survive. The hero must bring something back, a gift, a wisdom, a transformation, something that benefits not only the hero, but the community the hero returns to. Carl Jung steps back. He lets the 3 words breathe on the board. Then he says, "The journey is not a metaphor for life. It is the structure of psychological growth." Carl Jung erases the board. He draws 2 figures, one enormous, the other small, David and Goliath. Carl Jung looks at the drawing for a moment. Then he begins. Goliath represents the overwhelming problem, that which appears invincible. It may be a fear that has followed you for years, a trauma that never fully healed, an oppressive authority that silenced your voice, or an internal limitation you believed was permanent. Every person has their Goliath. The specific form changes. The psychological function remains identical. Now, Carl Jung points to David. David does not prepare by trying to become Goliath. He does not put on armor that does not fit. He does not adopt strategies that belong to someone else. David uses what he has. He trusts his singularity. 5 smooth stones, a sling that his hands knew perfectly, and the psychological clarity to aim at exactly the right point. Carl Jung underlines something on the board. This is the first lesson of the archetype. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is acting despite it. But there is something deeper here. Before David faces Goliath, David has already faced something else. He has faced the opinion of those who told him he was too small, too young, too inexperienced, too unknown. Carl Jung pauses, then says something quietly. The first Goliath is never out there. The first Goliath is the voice inside that says, "Who do you think you are?" This internal Goliath speaks the language of self-doubt. It knows all your history, all your failures, all your private wounds, and it uses that knowledge against you. The hero does not silence this voice by pretending it does not exist. The hero moves forward in spite of it. Carl Jung draws a circle around both figures on the board. He says, the battle between David and Goliath is not a story about the past. It is happening right now. In every person who dares to face what frightens them. Carl Jung sets down the chalk. He walks slowly to the window. The light falls across his face. He mentions a name, Odysseus. Unlike the hero who only conquers, Odysseus is the hero who returns. Carl Jung turns from the window. He explains, after the Trojan War, Odysseus does not go home immediately. He faces 10 years of wandering, monsters, temptations, losses, detours that could consume an entire lifetime. The Cyclops who threatens to devour him. The sirens who call with the sweetest voices. The island of Circe, where men forget who they are. Carl Jung stops. He says, notice what each of these obstacles does. Each one tries to make Odysseus forget where he is going. This is not coincidental. Carl Jung explains that in depth psychology, the greatest temptation on the heroic path is not destruction, it is distraction. The monster that destroys you in one blow is rare, but the island where you forget yourself, that is encountered every day. Carl Jung returns to the board. He writes, Nostos, the Greek word for homecoming, the root of the word nostalgia. In depth psychology, this is crucial. The true hero does not lose himself in the adventure. He returns transformed. But what is the home Odysseus is returning to? Carl Jung speaks carefully here. On the surface, it is Ithaca, his kingdom, his wife, his son. But psychologically, the home is the self. The return symbolizes the integration of experience. Everything Odysseus endured must be carried back and woven into who he is. Otherwise, the journey was only suffering, not transformation. Carl Jung faces the viewer directly. He asks, not with words, but with his gaze, how many people face battles, yet never return to themselves? How many survive the trial, but carry the wound without the wisdom? The mature hero learns something essential. It is not enough to survive the trial. Meaning must be extracted from it. Carl Jung writes one final word beneath Gnostos, integration. The call to heroism does not always arrive as a dramatic moment. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet, uncomfortable truth. A relationship that has become suffocating. A career that no longer reflects who you are. A silence you have maintained for too long. A dream you have been postponing for decades. Carl Jung explains something that depth psychology has documented extensively when the call arrives. The first response is almost always refusal. This is not weakness. It is the psyche protecting itself from the unknown. The refusal is rational. Change is dangerous. Growth is painful. And the old life, however limiting, is at least familiar. Carl Jung pauses. Then he says something unexpected. The refusal of the call is not a failure. It is part of the journey, but the refusal has a cost. Carl Jung writes on the board: stagnation, resentment, hollow safety. When the call is refused, the unlived life does not disappear. It turns inward. It becomes anxiety without a name, anger without a cause, the persistent feeling that something essential is missing. Carl Jung observed that people who repress the hero often become resentful, passive, or cynical, because the energy meant for transformation has nowhere to go. He turns to face the viewer again and says something very direct. The call does not punish you for refusing, but it returns in a different form, with more insistence. Strength, courage, and resilience. The three pillars. Carl Jung returns to the center of the room. He holds up 3 fingers. The hero archetype develops 3 essential pillars. The first, strength. Not only physical strength, but psychological strength. The capacity to hold tension without collapsing, to carry weight without transferring it onto others, to remain present when every instinct says to flee. Carl Jung observes that psychological strength is not about being unmoved. It is about being moved and not swept away. The second pillar, courage, the willingness to face the internal unknown. Carl Jung spent decades studying human beings who were trapped, not by external circumstances, but by their own fear of what they might discover about themselves. The shadow, the parts of the self that were hidden, the impulses that were never integrated. Courage, in this sense, is the willingness to look without turning away. The third pillar, resilience, the ability to continue, even when wounded. Carl Jung was careful to distinguish resilience from stoicism. Stoicism denies the wound. Resilience acknowledges the wound and continues anyway. The hero does not pretend the trial was easy. The hero does not claim that pain was not felt. The hero says, "I was wounded, and I kept going." Carl Jung writes on the board beneath the three pillars, dignity in the struggle, because the hero does not guarantee victory. He guarantees dignity in the struggle. The 12 labors of Hercules, the hero in full form, Carl Jung walks to the blackboard one final time. He draws the figure of Hercules, the most famous hero of the ancient world. But Carl Jung begins in an unusual place. He does not begin with the labors. He begins with the crime. Before the 12 labors, Hercules committed an act of terrible violence. In a moment of madness, he destroyed what he loved most, and then he had to live with that. Carl Jung underlines this. Hercules does not begin pure. He begins impulsive, guilty, uncontrolled. The labors are his path of redemption and maturation. Carl Jung explains each labor as a symbolic trial of the psyche. The Nemean lion facing the unbeatable fear. The Lernaean hydra confronting problems that multiply when avoided. The Augean stables cleaning what was allowed to rot for too long. The Cerberus descending into the underworld and returning. Each labor is not a test of physical power. Each labor is a test of psychological maturity. Carl Jung pauses at the board. He speaks slowly. Notice that no labor is completed without a cost. Hercules is poisoned, wounded, betrayed, humiliated. But each time he completes the task, the 12 labors represent something universal. The process of moving from a reactive, unconscious life to a conscious, integrated one, mastering impulses, repairing mistakes, serving something greater than the ego. Carl Jung writes something below the drawing. The hero is not born ready. He is forged through trials. And here, Carl Jung adds something that changes everything. Hercules is remembered, not because he was perfect. He is remembered because he faced 12 impossible tasks and did not stop. The shadow of the hero, when courage becomes destruction. Carl Jung steps back from the board. He sits down, and for a moment he is quiet. Then he says something that surprises the viewer. The hero archetype also has a shadow. This is the part most people never discuss. The hero who cannot stop fighting. The warrior who brings war home. And forgot to be human in the process. Carl Jung understood that every archetype carries a shadow expression. The shadow of the hero is the inability to rest. the compulsion to fight even when peace is possible, the confusion between strength and aggression, between courage and recklessness, between persistence and stubbornness. Carl Jung stands again. He says, "A man who can only fight has made his wound into his identity. The integrated hero knows when to put down the sword. He knows the difference between necessary conflict and habitual war." Because here is what Carl Jung discovered across decades of clinical work. Some people activate the hero archetype in response to genuine danger, and others activate it in response to silence. Because silence is where the deeper work begins, and the hero who fears silence has not yet completed the journey. The hero in your own life, a personal reflection. Carl Jung walks slowly toward the viewer. He speaks differently now, not as a scholar, not as a professor, as someone who has sat with thousands of people in the most honest moments of their lives. He asks, where in your own life is the hero being called? Not asked, called. Is there a conversation you have been avoiding? A truth you have been postponing? A version of yourself that keeps trying to emerge, but you keep pushing back down? Carl Jung is not asking these questions to create anxiety. He is asking them because the hero within you already knows the answers. The hero archetype is not activated by reading about it. It is activated by honest self-confrontation. Carl Jung explains, every person has a life they are living, and a life they are capable of living. The gap between those two lives is where the hero is waiting. He does not emerge from comfort. He does not emerge from permission. He emerges from necessity, from the moment when you say to yourself, this cannot continue as it is. Final scene, the next archetype, the car moves quietly along the road. The battlefield is now far behind. Dust slowly disappears in the distance. Carl Jung keeps his eyes on the road. For a long while, there is silence, the kind of silence that is not empty, the kind that holds something. Then, Carl Jung speaks. The hero is necessary, but the hero cannot rule, because the hero knows how to fight, but he does not yet know how to create order. He knows how to endure, but he does not yet know how to govern. He knows how to survive the storm, but he does not yet know how to build what survives the storm. Carl Jung slows the car. Something appears on the horizon. At first, it is only a silhouette, not a battlefield, not a weapon, a throne. Carl Jung speaks again. When the hero survives his trials, a far more difficult question appears. What will he do with power? Because beyond the battlefield, another archetype is waiting. Not the warrior, the ruler, the king. And the king does not ask, can you fight? He asks something far more dangerous. Can you govern your own life? Carl Jung accelerates. The throne grows closer, and for a moment, the road becomes silent. Because the road of the psyche does not end with victory. It begins with responsibility. The car continues forward, and somewhere ahead, the king is waiting. If this video spoke to you, subscribe to the channel and continue the journey, because on the road of the psyche, Carl Jung is still driving, and another archetype is waiting ahead.